Hi, I'm Marin Still, and last week I watched a 15-year-old ignore very specific advice from a very experienced adult and immediately regret it. Not my business to say what the advice was. But I will say that the experienced adult had a point. The 15-year-old had a theory, and the theory was wrong in a way that was both completely predictable and apparently necessary to discover personally. And I remember thinking, every single generation does this. But here is the question I could not stop thinking about afterward. Was there a 15-year-old in a cave somewhere, 80,000 years ago, who looked at their parents' careful, hard-won knowledge about which snake to avoid, and thought, how bad could it actually be? Hi, I'm Marin Still, and the answer, confirmed by anthropology, evolutionary biology, and an embarrassing amount of neuroscience, is yes. Absolutely yes. The teenager existed. The eye roll existed. The dismissal of accumulated survival wisdom in favor of personal experimentation existed. And in a world where the colorful snake actually killed you, the stakes of being 15 and wrong were significantly higher than they are today. Stay with me. It gets weirder. Let's start with why teenage rebellion exists at all. Because the answer is not laziness, not disrespect, and not some modern invention created by social media or absent parents. The answer is evolution, and the evolutionary logic is so clean that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The developmental neuroscientist Sarah Jane Blakemore at University College London has spent years studying the adolescent brain and found something that reframes every frustrating interaction between teenagers and adults in human history. The adolescent brain is not a broken adult brain. It is a brain in a specific developmental phase that serves a specific evolutionary function. During adolescence, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for risk assessment, impulse control, and deference to established knowledge, is still developing. It will not be fully formed until the mid-20s, but simultaneously, the brain's reward systems, dopamine circuits associated with novelty, social status, and peer validation, are running at peak sensitivity, higher than at any other point in a human life. In plain English, the teenage brain is designed to seek new experiences, challenge existing authority, and prioritize peer approval over parental instruction. Not as a malfunction, as a feature. And here is why. The evolutionary anthropologist Barry Bogan at Loughborough University argues that adolescence as a distinct life phase, present in humans, but dramatically compressed or absent in other primates, evolved specifically to facilitate the transfer of individuals between social groups. In small prehistoric bands, breeding within the same tight group for too many generations creates genetic problems. Someone had to leave. Someone had to be willing to separate from the known, the familiar, the parental authority structure, and move towards strangers. That someone was the teenager. And the brain wiring that made them willing to do it, the novelty seeking, the peer orientation, the dismissal of parental caution, was not a bug in the design. It was the mechanism. Your ancestors' 15-year-old was not trying to be difficult. They were running a 50,000-year-old dispersal program. Now let's talk about what that actually looked like in practice, because the specific content of prehistoric teenage rebellion was different from today's version in some genuinely important ways. The archaeological and anthropological record gives us some surprisingly specific data. The bioarchaeologist April Nowell at the University of Victoria has studied evidence of risk-taking behavior in prehistoric populations and found skeletal trauma patterns in adolescent-aged individuals that are distinctly different from adult trauma patterns. Adults in prehistoric communities showed trauma patterns consistent with specific, purposeful activities, hunting injuries at expected locations, wear patterns from repeated skilled tasks. Adolescent trauma was more varied, more distributed, more consistent with the pattern you would get from someone attempting unfamiliar physical activities across multiple domains. In other words, the teenagers were trying things they had not been trained to do, things the adults in their community had specifically not taught them, which suggests they were specifically not waiting to be taught. The hunter-gatherer ethnographer Kim Hill at Arizona State University, who has spent decades living with and studying foraging communities in Paraguay and elsewhere, documented consistent patterns of adolescent behavior across the communities he studied that would be immediately recognizable to any modern parent. Adolescents consistently overestimated their own competence relative to adults. They consistently took on tasks before they had developed the skills to perform them successfully, and they consistently pushed back against direct instruction from older community members, preferring to learn through their own experience rather than through transmitted knowledge. Which sounds frustrating, until you realize that in an environment where no two situations are exactly alike, where weather patterns shift, prey migration routes change, and the specific plants that are toxic in one season might be safe in another, an individual who experiments independently builds a different kind of knowledge than an individual who only follows inherited rules. They build adaptable knowledge, generative knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can respond to a situation the parents never encountered because it did not exist when the parents were learning. The 15-year-old touching the colorful snake was wrong about that specific snake, but the 15-year-old who survived touching the colorful snake learned something no one had taught them. And in a world that was constantly changing, that experimental disposition, dangerous as it was part of what kept the species adaptable. Now let's talk about how the prehistoric community responded to a teenager who was being a teenager. Because this is the part that is simultaneously very familiar and very different. The anthropologist David Lancy at Utah State University has spent his career studying childhood and adolescence across cultures, and found something that consistently surprises Western audiences. In most traditional and small-scale societies he has documented, children and adolescents are not instructed in the way Western educational models assume. They learn primarily through observation and self-directed participation. Adults do not sit children down and explain things. Children watch, and then they try, and the community responds to the attempt. Which means the prehistoric parent's primary intervention tool was not explanation. It was consequence management. If the teenager tried something dangerous and nothing bad happened, the behavior continued. If the teenager tried something dangerous and something bad happened, the community's response, ranging from practical assistance to social commentary, to, in the most serious cases, the kind of communal mockery that Christopher Boeheim documented as the prehistoric leveling mechanism, provided the feedback that shaped future behavior. In plain English, the prehistoric equivalent of a parent saying, "I told you so," was delivered not in private, with kindness and a learning moment, but in front of the entire camp, loudly, with commentary from everyone present, which was, by every available account, effective, and humiliating, and remembered. The primatologist Frans de Waal at Emory University has documented similar patterns in chimpanzee communities, the closest living relatives to humans, where adolescent males consistently push boundaries, take risks, challenge established hierarchies, and are consistently corrected through community social response, rather than parental authority alone. The response is collective, because the disruption is collective. A teenager who does something dangerous in a small band threatens everyone. And here is where the modern slap arrives. Because I want you to think about the specific frustration of being a parent, or a teacher, or any adult who has tried to give genuinely useful knowledge to a 15-year-old who was not interested in receiving it. That frustration is not a modern problem. It is not a problem created by smartphones or social media, or whatever cultural shift the current decade is being blamed for. That frustration is as old as the first time an experienced adult watched a younger person ignore hard-won knowledge in favor of personal experimentation and thought, why won't they just listen? And the answer is, because they are not supposed to. Because the same brain that makes them infuriating to parent is the brain that made your ancestors adaptable enough to survive ice ages, migrate across continents, and populate every habitable environment on the planet. The dispersal instinct, the novelty-seeking, the stubborn conviction that their own direct experience is more reliable than inherited knowledge. It was right, just often enough to matter. It was wrong often enough that every prehistoric community had very specific protocols for managing it. And somewhere in the archaeological record, in the trauma patterns of adolescent bones, in the worn edges of tools used incorrectly, in the sites where someone clearly attempted something that the evidence suggests they were not yet skilled enough to attempt, is the first teenager who looked at everything their parents had carefully learned and thought, I want to find out for myself. We are still finding out for ourselves. Every generation, in every language, In every landscape. The snake got smarter. The teenager did not. Hi, I'm Marin Still, and now you can never unknow this.